Hey, Derek here from Civic Punks. So I think we're still designing policy for a world that doesn't exist anymore. I saw this really clearly last week in Canberra. I just come from the Government Innovation Week in Melbourne. A big event, super polished, lots of ideas, tons of people. And then last week, I went to the OpenFisca conference in Canberra. Much smaller, maybe 40 to 50 people, and way more grassroots. It was really organized by a bunch of people off the side of their desk, but it felt really good to be there. The people, the ideas, the passion, the conversations were completely different. In Melbourne, it's like, hey, here's some new ideas, here's what's coming down the pipes, check it out. Whereas in Canberra, it's like, this is what I'm working on. What are you working on? Let's figure this out together. What are you wrestling with? It was much more of a conversation. One of the key things that's really sticking with me from it is this idea that we're still treating policy like it's something you design, when it's actually something that is constantly being managed and changed. We talked about the policy cycle, research, design, implement, evaluate, and how you kind of work through that iteration. But in practice, that's way too linear because you launch something and immediately you have to pivot and change and adapt. Policy isn't a product, it's a relationship, an ongoing relationship between people, their communities, and the institutions they build. And that relationship doesn't end, it just keeps shifting and changing. But the problem is our system isn't built to think along those lines. They're built for decisions, left or right, for moments in time, for stability. One of the speakers, Suhit, had this really cool framing that is sticking with me, and I'm going to be interviewing him later to go much more in depth with it. But here's sort of a high-level overview. He talks about vibes, loops, and lines. Vibes are things that, it's like when you enter into a space and there isn't really much known and you're just going to go with your intuition. Your vibes, right? And that's how you dictate how you move forward. Loops is all about that sort of iterative process. Get rapid feedback, change, pivot, stuff like that. And then lines are much more structured, institutionalized. And realistically, all three are happening at the same time. It's just which one do you lean into more? The problem we have is, of course, how we do policy is very much like lines and maybe loops. Much more linear, much more structured. And that's just not how policy works in practice. And this is where all the tools start to get really interesting. So one of the things we talked a lot about at OpenFisca is rules as code. I've already created a video about it, but it is a concept worth digging more into. Basically, it's taking the logic behind a policy, your eligibility, decisions on who gets access to what, how things work, that process, and making it explicit and machine readable. And the thing about that is that when you put it into this logic, you start to see where things don't make sense, where policies might contradict, where you end up with a dead end in the process, and where on the edges things start to break down. Next, we've got digital twins. Again, a really exciting concept, which basically allows you to simulate a policy or program before you roll it out. Again, this sounds obvious, but we never get to do this, particularly with policies. Now we are able to do it. The technology exists to do this, and it's really cool, and I expect that we're going to be seeing a lot more use of digital twins. And then the other thing with digital twins is this idea of synthetic data. And synthetic data is basically a copy of real data, but it's been tweaked. In the aggregate, it's the same, but the specifics are unique and different. And this allows you to basically deal with real data without issues of privacy. So we're going to see a lot more synthetic data moving forward. And the outcome of this is that you can start getting some really, something much closer to real-time feedback. You can test things out and practice and play around with them before putting them into the wild. The challenge, of course, with all of this is that our policy teams, our legislative cycles, they don't support this type of stuff. These tools are built for fast and adaptive world, and our institutions just aren't that. Our legislation isn't written for code. Our policies aren't designed to be simulated. So we've got these tools, which is amazing, but we're plugging them into systems that don't quite know what to do with them yet. This mismatch is showing up everywhere. And of course, you layer AI on top of this, and it's just a mess. Because AI really unlocks the potential to use these tools in new and exciting ways, but we're not even close to ready for that yet. AI also raises a big question for me, which is, as we move towards a government that's using AI more and more and more, what do we keep as human? As we move towards a government that's increasingly efficient and frictionless, what do we choose to put friction into intentionally? Because if we make things more efficient, we risk making them less human, because humans are many things. Efficient is not one of them. And that's okay. In fact, that's a good thing many times. So do we want our governments to just be pure efficiency, but not human? I don't know. It doesn't feel right to me. Another thing that came up a bunch is this idea that government is losing its ability to remember and to learn. People are moving roles a lot, and with that, we're losing institutional memory as they move. Knowledge doesn't stick the same way it used to. Lessons get lost. So we end up just relearning the same things because we're outsourcing more. We're outsourcing to consultants and vendors, and increasingly to AI. So we're building systems to replace knowledge that we used to have. And I just feel like that's something that we should be paying more attention to. Like, what are we losing in the process here? The final thing that starts sticking with me is how people are talking about government itself. Less as an institution and more as an ecosystem that includes the markets and the private sector. It includes communities. It includes kinship networks, some of these other informal networks. There's this idea of moving from a digital government to a digital commons. So moving from not just being about services and transactions, but actually a shared infrastructure that others can build upon. It really reminded me of Tim O'Reilly's article on government as a platform from way back in the day. But this time it feels real and plausible, like we're actually doing this. The tension this raises, though, is that people increasingly want and expect to be able to shape systems in a world where they're having less and less of an ability to do that. So expectations and reality are diverging because the system isn't designed to include them. One example where an alternative became real for me is this idea of OpenFisca itself. OpenFisca, first off, definitely check it out. What OpenFisca is an open source way to turn policy into code. It's a process to make rules as code a thing. But it's not just a tool, it's a global community. I mean, at OpenFisca, we had teams from Japan, we had teams from Australia, from New Zealand, France, all coming together to share how they are using OpenFisca to implement rules as code within their given context on their given project. And the cool thing is, it's not being owned by one government. It means that it's being iterated and evolved in all sorts of different contexts. And I think it gives a glimpse of where this could all be headed. So we're going through this challenging time where increasingly we're seeing friction. Things are feeling slow, hard to change, disconnected from reality. If you're outside government, this is showing up as having less influence and government feeling more like a black box that's harder to engage with. Underneath all this is a core issue. The system was built for a different kind of world than we now live in. So I don't think this is actually just about better tools, although that does help. I think we're in this awkward in-between moment where old ways don't really hold, but are still everywhere. And new ways are still taking shape. We're kind of stitching it together as we go in this really awkward kind of way. So what can we do to actually start changing this now, before this gap gets even bigger? Curious to know how this is showing up for you. And as always, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. I'll see you next time on Civic Punks.